Miami, Florida, February 25, 1964, 2:47 a.m. A hotel room at the Hampton House Motel where the celebration should have been deafening. Hours earlier, 22-year-old Cassius Clay had shocked the world by defeating Sonny Liston to become the heavyweight champion, the youngest champion in history, the most unlikely victory anyone had witnessed, but Clay wasn't celebrating. He sat on the edge of a bed in rumpled fight shorts and a white t-shirt, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Malcolm X sat across from him in a wooden chair, leaning forward, speaking quietly. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of a question Clay had been avoiding his entire life. Who do you want to be? Not who the world wants you to be. Who do you choose to become? Clay looked up. His face was still swollen from the fight, his eyes exhausted but searching, and that's when Malcolm said 6 words that ended one man's existence and birthed another. Your name is your first freedom. Clay's breathing changed. Something cracked open inside him. By sunrise, Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., the charming Louisville showman who made white America fall in love with him, would begin to die. And Muhammad Ali, the man who refused to be what anyone expected, would step into the world. This is the story of those 6 words. And the brotherhood that burned so bright it could only end in separation. Cassius Clay was born in Louisville, Kentucky, in 1942, into a world that told black children exactly who they were allowed to be. His father, Cassius Sr., was a sign painter who created advertisements for white businesses while battling alcoholism and rage at a system that denied him dignity. His mother, Odessa, was a domestic worker who cleaned white people's homes while raising her own children in a modest house on the west side of Louisville. Clay grew up in a segregated city where success for a black boy meant staying in your lane, not making white people uncomfortable, and accepting the limits placed on your ambition. The swimming pools were whites only. The schools were separate and unequal. Even after winning championships, young Clay couldn't eat at certain restaurants downtown. But Clay was never built for limits. At 12 years old, someone stole his bicycle, a red and white Schwinn he'd saved for months to buy. Furious, Clay marched to a police officer at the Louisville Home Show and said he was going to whoop whoever took it. The officer, Joe Martin, who also ran a boxing gym, told him he'd better learn to fight first. So Clay walked into Columbia Gym the next day, and he never stopped moving. By 18, he'd won a gold medal at the 1960 Rome Olympics. By 20, he was the most exciting young fighter in America. Fast, beautiful, cocky beyond measure. He talked trash before fights, predicted the exact round he'd win, charmed reporters with rhymes and charisma that seemed effortless. White sports writers loved him because he seemed safe, entertaining but non-threatening. A black athlete who played the game the way white audiences wanted. He smiled, he joked. He never made them uncomfortable with talk of racism or injustice. But beneath the showmanship, Clay was drowning in a question he couldn't articulate. Is this all I am? A spectacle, a performer for people who would never see me as fully human. In 1962, Cassius Clay met Malcolm X for the first time. It wasn't planned, it wasn't destiny, it was chance meeting necessity. Clay was in Detroit training for a fight, staying at a hotel in the black section of the city. Someone mentioned that Malcolm X was speaking that night at a local Nation of Islam mosque. Clay had heard about the Nation, the suits, the bow ties, the discipline, the refusal to beg white people for acceptance. But he'd also heard they were extremists, separatists, dangerous. His handlers had warned him to stay away from those people, but curiosity won. Clay slipped into the back of the mosque during Malcolm's speech, wearing sunglasses and a hat, trying to be invisible. What he saw changed everything. Malcolm X stood at the front of the room in a dark suit and black-rimmed glasses, commanding absolute attention without raising his voice. No begging, no compromise, no performance, just clarity that cut through confusion like a blade. Malcolm spoke about black identity, self-respect, economic independence. He spoke about the psychological damage of living in a country that hated you for your skin while demanding you smile and be grateful. He spoke about the lie of integration, the trap of respectability politics, the necessity of defining yourself before the world defined you. Clay had never heard anyone speak like that. Confident without arrogance, certain without cruelty, intellectually devastating without shouting. Every white person Clay had encountered in positions of power spoke down to him, even when praising him. Every black leader he'd heard spoke carefully, measuring words to avoid white backlash. But Malcolm spoke as if white approval didn't matter, as if the only Audience that counted was the one in that room. After the speech, Clay couldn't move. He sat in his seat while others filed out, processing what he'd just heard. Finally, he stood and approached Malcolm near the exit. He didn't know what to say. His mouth went dry. He just extended his hand and said, "I'm Cassius Clay." Malcolm shook it. "I know who you are." And in that moment, something started that neither man fully understood yet. Over the next 2 years, Malcolm and Clay built a relationship that was part mentorship, part brotherhood, part spiritual awakening. Malcolm saw in Clay something the young fighter didn't fully see in himself yet: potential for more than boxing, a platform, a voice, the ability to reach millions of young black people who were tired of waiting for white approval. Clay saw in Malcolm a father figure he'd been searching for, someone who believed in him not because of what he could do in the ring, but because of who he could become outside of it. They talked for hours, in hotel rooms, in cars, in quiet corners of mosques. Malcolm introduced Clay to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. He gave him books. He challenged his thinking. He asked questions Clay had never been forced to answer. Why do you perform for white audiences? Why do you let them name you? Why do you accept their applause while they deny you basic dignity? Clay didn't have good answers, but the questions haunted him. The Nation of Islam offered Clay something he'd never had: structure, belonging, a worldview that explained the anger and confusion he'd been carrying, but it also demanded something: commitment, sacrifice. The willingness to lose everything white America had given him, and that terrified Clay because he liked being loved. He liked the attention, the fame, the way crowds chanted his name. He'd worked his entire life to become Cassius Clay, Olympic champion, rising star, the Louisville Lip. Malcolm was asking him to kill that identity, to walk away from the safety of respectability, to choose a name, a faith, a life that would make him a target. Clay wanted both. He wanted Malcolm's truth and white America's approval, but Malcolm knew you couldn't have both. One was real, the other was a cage. In 1963, the tension came to a head. Clay signed to fight Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship. Liston was a monster, ex-convict, mob connections, a man who intimidated opponents before they even entered the ring. Clay was 7-1 underdog. No one gave him a chance, but Malcolm saw the fight differently. He saw it as a parable: the young, fast, beautiful underdog against the brutal, feared establishment, the future against the past. Malcolm traveled to Miami to be with Clay during training camp. He brought his family, his wife Betty and their children. They stayed at the Hampton House, a black-owned motel in Overtown, Miami's segregated black neighborhood. Malcolm's presence was controversial. The press started asking questions. Why was Cassius Clay spending time with Malcolm X, the most dangerous black radical in America? Clay's handlers panicked. They told him to distance himself from Malcolm, that the association would ruin his career, that sponsors would pull out, that white America would turn on him. Clay was torn. He loved Malcolm, respected him, needed him, but he was also terrified of losing everything. The night before the fight, Clay's camp was in chaos. His blood pressure was spiking. He couldn't sleep. The weight of expectation, fear, and internal conflict was crushing him. Malcolm found him alone in his hotel room, pacing. "You scared of Liston?" Malcolm asked. Clay shook his head. "Then what?" Clay sat down, and for the first time he told Malcolm the truth. "I'm scared of who I'll have to be after I win." Malcolm understood immediately, because winning meant choosing. If Clay won, he'd have the biggest platform in sports. Every word he spoke would be amplified. Every choice he made would define him. He could stay Cassius Clay, beloved entertainer, safe and profitable, or he could become something else, something the world wasn't ready for. Malcolm leaned forward. "The hardest fight isn't in the ring tomorrow. It's the one you're having with yourself right now." Clay looked at him. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Malcolm's response was immediate. "You already are, you just don't know it yet." February 25, 1964. Clay entered the ring as a clown, a loudmouth, a fighter no one believed in. He left the ring as the heavyweight champion of the world. Liston quit on his stool after the 6th round, the upset of the century, but Clay didn't celebrate the way champions usually did. He was quiet, reflective, almost numb. That night back at the Hampton House, the after-party raged in the common areas. Music, laughter, people who hadn't believed in Clay now wanted to be near him. But Clay slipped away. He went to Malcolm's room. Malcolm was alone, reading. He looked up when Clay walked in. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Clay spoke. "I have to decide now, don't I?" Malcolm nodded. "The world is going to ask you who you are. You need to know the answer before they do." Clay's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know how to stop being who they want me to be." And that's when Malcolm said it. 6 words, simple, devastating, liberating. Your name is your first freedom. Clay sat with those words. Your name is your first freedom. Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. was a slave name, Cassius after a white plantation owner, Marcellus after another. Clay, the property designation passed down from enslavers. He'd carried that name his whole life, never questioning it. It was just who he was, but Malcolm was saying it wasn't who he had to be. That names are chosen or inherited, that identity is claimed or imposed, that the first act of self-determination is naming yourself. Clay felt something break inside him, not violently, quietly, like ice cracking under pressure. He thought about every time someone had called him Cassius, every time he'd answered to a name given by people who owned his ancestors, every time he'd performed the role of the good black athlete who made white people comfortable. And he realized Malcolm was right. He'd never been free, not really. He'd been celebrated, rewarded, loved, but not free. Freedom meant choosing who you were even when the world hated you for it. The next morning, Clay held a press conference. Reporters expected him to gloat about the victory, predict his next fight, entertain them. Instead, he announced he was a member of the Nation of Islam, that he rejected the name Cassius Clay, that he would no longer answer to the slave name his ancestors were forced to carry. The room erupted, questions fired from every direction, accusations, outrage, betrayal. How could he align himself with a hate group? How could he disrespect his parents? How could he throw away his career? Clay stood at the podium calm. I don't have to be what you want me to be. I'm free to be who I want. A few days later, Elijah Muhammad gave him a new name, Muhammad Ali, Muhammad after the Prophet. Ali meaning elevated, exalted. It wasn't just a name. It was a rebirth. Cassius Clay, the entertainer, the safe Negro, the Olympic hero who wore his gold medal to segregated restaurants only to be denied service, died. Muhammad Ali, the man who refused to fight in Vietnam, who sacrificed his prime years for principle, who spoke truth regardless of cost, was born. But the name change came with a cost Malcolm hadn't anticipated. When Clay became Ali, he aligned himself fully with the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. And by early 1964, Malcolm was in open conflict with Elijah Muhammad. Philosophical differences about the movement's direction. Malcolm's growing belief that the nation's separatist ideology was too narrow. And personal betrayals Malcolm couldn't ignore. Malcolm's suspension from the nation became permanent, then hostile. Ali was faced with another impossible choice. Stay loyal to Malcolm, the man who'd awakened his consciousness, who'd been there in Miami when no one else believed. Or stay loyal to the nation, the organization that gave him structure and belonging he'd never had. Elijah Muhammad's son Herbert was now managing Ali's career. The pressure was explicit. You can't have both. Malcolm is out. He's dangerous. If you stay close to him, you're choosing him over the nation. Ali was 22 years old, terrified of losing the only spiritual home he'd known. He chose the nation. He stopped returning Malcolm's calls. When reporters asked about Malcolm, Ali's words were cruel. Malcolm X has gone the wrong way. Nobody listens to Malcolm anymore. We don't speak to him. Malcolm heard those words. He was devastated, not because he needed Ali's loyalty, but because he'd seen Ali as a younger brother who understood that freedom meant thinking for yourself, not just switching masters. The separation wasn't dramatic, no confrontation, just silence, the kind of silence that hurts more than any words. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21, 1965, shot 16 times while giving a speech at the Audubon Ballroom in New York. Ali didn't attend the funeral. Publicly, he said nothing, but privately, people close to him said he wept. Years later, long after Ali had left the Nation of Islam, long after he'd evolved beyond the rigid ideology of his youth, he spoke about Malcolm. He was the first person who made me think I could be more than a fighter. He gave me my name. He gave me my courage. I wish I'd been strong enough to stand with him when it mattered. The regret in his voice was unmistakable because Ali knew the truth. Malcolm had given him the blueprint for freedom. And when Malcolm needed that same freedom honored, Ali had chosen safety. But here's the thing about those 6 words. Your name is your first freedom. Didn't just change Ali's life, they changed history. Because Muhammad Ali, the man who refused to fight in Vietnam, who lost his title in his prime years for principle, who became a global symbol of resistance, wouldn't have existed without that night in Miami. Without Malcolm sitting across from a scared young champion and telling him the truth. That freedom isn't given, it's claimed. That identity isn't inherited, it's chosen. That the world will always try to name you, define you, limit you, but you don't have to accept it. You can choose who you become, even if it costs you everything, maybe especially then. Malcolm X never saw what Ali became. He died 13 months after speaking those 6 words, but his voice lived in every choice Ali made after that night, every time Ali refused to compromise, every time he spoke truth to power, every time he chose principle over popularity. That was Malcolm's legacy, not the Nation of Islam's version of Malcolm, not the sanitized, commodified version, but the Malcolm who sat in a hotel room at 2:47 a.m. and told a young man the most important thing anyone ever told him. You are who you choose to be, not who the world wants you to be. And the moment you claim that truth, you become dangerous, because free people can't be controlled. They can be punished, isolated, even killed, but they can't be controlled, and that's the only freedom that matters. In 2005, 41 years after that night in Miami, an aging Muhammad Ali attended the opening of a Malcolm X exhibit at a museum. His body was failing, ravaged by Parkinson's, his hands shook, his speech was slurred, but when asked about Malcolm, his eyes cleared. He said, "He taught me my name. Everything after that was because of him." Someone asked if he regretted the separation. Ali didn't answer directly. He just said, "Some debts you can never repay, you just carry them." The name Muhammad Ali became synonymous with courage, conviction, and the cost of standing for something. But it started with 6 words from a man who knew the price of freedom, who'd paid it himself. Who'd looked at a young champion drowning in the expectations of others and offered him the one thing that could save him: the truth.